Warner Brothers has distributed The Exorcist. They put A Clockwork Orange on disc without losing a night's sleep. And yet, for more than 50 years, one of the most written about films of the entire 1970s has never once received a US home video release. No DVD, no Blu-ray, not a single legitimate way to own it at home. The same studio that vaulted that film once lifted a character directly from it and dropped her into a children's basketball movie, rather than simply release the original. That one detail tells you more about how Hollywood treats inconvenient art than any press release ever could. 10 films, 10 separate stories about studios, distributors, and powerful individuals deciding that certain finished movies should stop existing. Some were buried over content, some over money, and some for reasons that still resist any clean explanation. Here's what actually happened. The Devil stands as one of the most aggressively suppressed completed films in studio history, and the studio doing the suppressing is the same one that cheerfully distributed The Exorcist and counted the receipts. Warner Brothers signed on to finance and distribute the film in March 1970, with production running through late 1970 at Pinewood Studios. Vanessa Redgrave and Oliver Reed led the cast. The finished cut ran 111 minutes, and the British Board of Film Classification issued an X certificate without much hesitation. The American version was trimmed further to roughly 108 minutes and collected its own X rating on arrival. 17 local councils across Britain banned it anyway, despite the British Board of Film Classification having already approved it, which gives you a sense of how the film landed culturally. Warner Brothers responded by keeping the film locked out of the US home video market entirely, a position the studio has maintained without apology ever since. Here is where the numbers become genuinely awkward for that argument. On its opening day in 1971, The Devils broke all previous single-day box office records at the Warner Rendezvous Cinema in London, with a take of £1,657 that surpassed anything the venue had recorded. This was not a film that embarrassed the studio financially. It was a hit, and they buried it anyway. The British Film Institute was permitted in 2012 to release a Region 2 DVD of the UK cut, though key sequences remained absent even from that version. Guillermo del Toro went public in 2014 with his criticism of Warner Brothers, describing what he saw as deliberate censorship of an important work. Russell himself stated plainly that the studio had killed the key scene and cut out the best of the Devils. Then came 2021 with Space Jam: A New Legacy. Tucked into the background of the courtside crowd, visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at, were Ursuline nuns lifted directly from the Devils. Warner Brothers acknowledged the film's visual power enough to sample its iconography for a family-rated basketball movie aimed at children, while continuing to refuse it any legitimate US release. That is not caution. That is something considerably harder to name. The most widely misunderstood fact about A Clockwork Orange in Britain is that the government never banned it. Stanley Kubrick made that call himself, and the distinction matters enormously. Produced by Polaris Productions and Hawk Films, and distributed by Warner Brothers in the US and by Columbia Warner in the UK, the film arrived in late 1971 with an X rating on both sides of the Atlantic. By early 1972, courtrooms were invoking it. A 14-year-old cited it during a manslaughter trial, and a 16-year-old in Bletchley was connected to the killing of an elderly vagrant. Christiane Kubrick later recalled receiving serious personal threats, with protesters gathering outside the family home on multiple occasions. Kubrick's response was to instruct Warner Brothers to withdraw the film from UK circulation, and Warner Brothers agreed to honor that instruction, which created what many film historians now describe as the most effective unofficial suppression of a mainstream film in British history. For 27 years, importing a VHS from another country was the only route a UK resident could legally take to watch A Clockwork Orange. The Scala Cinema Club in London screened it without authorization, and Warner Brothers, backed by Kubrick, pursued legal action. The Scala went into receivership in 1993 as a direct result of losing that case, meaning an independent cinema permanently closed its doors because it showed a film the studio technically owned and could have re-released at any point it chose. The film returned to UK screens in spring 2000, roughly a year after Kubrick's passing at age 70, having spent nearly 3 decades buried by its own director with full studio cooperation. 48 years. That is how long The Other Side of the Wind spent trying to reach an audience, and by the time it finally did, almost everyone who made it had already passed away. Welles began shooting in August 1970 with John Huston, Peter Bogdanovich, Susan Strasberg, and Oja Kodar leading a cast assembled around a satirical fake documentary about a director surrounded by Hollywood insiders pursuing their own agendas. The irony of that premise, given what was about to happen to the production, is the kind of thing you genuinely could not invent. Filming stopped when United States authorities determined that Welles's production company carried significant tax liability, resumed when that situation was resolved, then collapsed again after what Welles described in a 1975 interview with Tom Snyder in unambiguous terms. He said, "I got a backer and we shot a couple of weeks, and then that backer ran away with my money as well as his." Film scholars later identified Spanish producer Andrés Vicente Gómez as the figure allegedly responsible for the missing $250,000, and Gómez spent years publicly opposing the film's completion on the grounds that Welles lacked the energy to finish it. A man accused of taking $250,000 from a production, loudly explaining why that production should stay unfinished. Convenient timing, that position. The overthrow of the Shah of Iran in 1979 introduced a further complication because Iranian investors had funds tied to the production, and the political upheaval froze the negatives inside a legal dispute that took decades to untangle. Welles passed away in 1985, having never completed it. John Huston passed away, Dennis Hopper passed away. Nearly the entire cast was gone before a single public screening took place. Netflix assembled the finished film from approximately 100 hours of raw footage, working from Welles's own notes and rough cuts, and released it on November 2, 2018. The cast did not live to see it, Welles did not live to see it, and the man accused of triggering the collapse spent those intervening decades insisting the film was not worth finishing. Jerry Lewis toured Auschwitz and Dachau in February 1972, lost 35 pounds during pre-production, and poured everything into a film he then spent the rest of his life refusing to let anyone watch. The Day the Clown Cried was a Sweden-France co-production about a circus clown imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp, with Lewis directing and starring. Producer Nat Waxberger had committed to full financial backing, and when Lewis believed those commitments were not being honored, the relationship between the two collapsed entirely. Lewis left with a rough cut and kept it. In 2013, he addressed the film with characteristic bluntness. He said he was embarrassed, ashamed of the work, and grateful that he had the power to contain it all and never let anyone see it. He called it bad, bad, bad. He donated an incomplete print to the Library of Congress in 2015 with a stipulation barring access before June 2024. That seemed like a clean resolution. Then the situation became considerably less clean. A documentary called From Darkness to Light premiered at the Venice Film Festival in September 2024 and included several scenes from the film. Swedish actor Hans Crispin then publicly revealed in May 2025 that he had removed a full edited work print from production company Europa Film back in 1980 and held it quietly for 45 years before showing it to journalists. That work print reportedly sold to an unnamed private collector in June 2025. The original screenplay is also being actively revived, with producer Kia Jam of K-Jam Media confirming a purchase agreement on the O'Brien and Denton script as of August 2024. Whatever Lewis intended when he locked this film away, the pieces keep resurfacing in ways that suggest the burial was never going to hold permanently. Alejandro Jodorowsky made a film so genuinely strange that the only person willing to finance it apparently had limited insight into what they were funding. Alan Klein of ABKCO Films provided that backing. When The Holy Mountain was finished and a rights dispute erupted between Klein and Jodorowsky, the film entered a legal freeze and it stayed off legitimate distribution channels for the better part of 3 decades. The film had a real audience from the moment it was released in 1973, which made Klein's position financially puzzling to outsiders. Bootleg copies multiplied because no legitimate version was available, building an underground reputation that money alone could not manufacture. A BKCO eventually resolved the dispute and issued a restored DVD in 2007. By then, the film was regarded as one of the foundational works of surrealist cinema and a direct influence on multiple generations of filmmakers. Klein sat on the cultural artifact for 30 years, and all he achieved was making it more mythologized than it would have been with a normal release. British Lion Films managing director Michael Deeley reportedly held a low enough opinion of The Wicker Man to actively limit its theatrical release. That is an interesting creative judgment given that Christopher Lee considered it the finest performance of his entire career. The film, starring Edward Woodward alongside Lee, arrived in 1973. It was cut, received little promotion, and was released as a supporting feature with almost nothing behind it. A widely repeated claim holds that the original negative ended up as landfill beneath the M3 motorway, though that story has never been conclusively verified and deserves healthy, unverified skepticism. What is documented is that Lee personally lobbied distributors for years to give the film a proper release, refusing to allow it to disappear quietly while the studio moved on. A reconstruction, drawing on elements including a print found at the Harvard Film Archive, was eventually released by Studio Canal on Blu-ray in 2013. Lee described the resulting final cut as the closest surviving version to what Hardy had originally intended. Without Lee's persistence, there is a reasonable argument the film would simply be gone. I find that kind of sustained loyalty to a piece of work genuinely admirable. Last Tango in Paris earned 2 Academy Award nominations in 1973 for Best Director and Best Actor and was simultaneously banned in Italy. The Italian Supreme Court ordered all copies of the film destroyed in 1976 before that ruling was eventually overturned. United Artists distributed it internationally. The film survived, and for a long time that seemed like the full story. What complicated the picture considerably was what emerged about the circumstances surrounding the filming of a particular scene. Accusations surfaced from Maria Schneider about aspects of the production she had not been informed about in advance, and Bertolucci later acknowledged that certain details had been deliberately withheld from her. When archival interview footage addressing those circumstances circulated widely in 2016, the response was immediate, and the reassessment of the film's legacy has continued without resolution ever since. The film still exists and is still studied, but the account behind it is now impossible to separate from the work itself. That is probably the appropriate outcome. Pier Paolo Pasolini died under deeply troubling circumstances on November 2, 1975, before Salo reached audiences. He never witnessed the bans, the destruction orders, or the decades of controversy that followed his final film Into the World. Italy banned the film shortly after its initial release. Australia, New Zealand, Finland, and the UK banned it or heavily censored it in the 1970s and the 1990s. Pasolini adapted the Marquis de Sade's work and relocated it to the fascist Republic of Salo in 1944, intending it as a political allegory about power, cruelty, and institutional violence. Critics at the time largely reacted to the surface content and stopped there. Academic film scholarship eventually caught up with the deeper argument Pasolini was making. The Criterion Collection restoration has since established Salo as a serious work of political art, a conclusion that would have seemed implausible, even absurd, to nearly anyone reviewing it in 1975. Roger Corman's New World Pictures produced Cockfighter, with Warren Oates carrying the lead role and Monty Hellman directing. The distributor pulled it from theaters almost immediately after release when it failed to find an audience. The reissue under the title Born to Kill also failed, while Drifter failed after that. 3 separate title attempts, 3 separate commercial disappointments, and a director who maintained throughout that this was among the best work he had ever done. He was very likely correct. Cockfighter is now regarded as a significant entry in 1970s American independent cinema, valued precisely for the uncompromising qualities that made it a commercial non-starter in its own decade, the kind of film that gets written off by one generation and quietly claimed as essential by the next. Mike Nichols directed Carnal Knowledge with Jack Nicholson, Art Garfunkel, Anne Margaret, and Candice Bergen in a film distributed by Avico Embassy Pictures. It earned Anne Margaret an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress, was banned in Italy, and became the subject of a criminal prosecution in the state of Georgia, all within a few years of its release. A theater owner was arrested and convicted of distributing obscene material for screening the film, and the case moved through the courts until it reached the United States Supreme Court. In Jenkins v. Georgia, 1974, the conviction was overturned and the court ruled that Carnal Knowledge did not meet the legal definition of obscenity. A finished mainstream film had been used as the basis for a criminal conviction taken to the highest court in the country and legally vindicated at that level. That is quite an arc for a film most contemporary viewers have never encountered. The thread connecting all 10 of these is consistent. A studio, a distributor, a director, or one powerful individual decided that a completed work of cinema was too inconvenient to remain accessible. Sometimes content was the stated reason, sometimes money, sometimes ego, and sometimes the explanation offered simply does not hold together under examination. What happened in nearly every case was the same. The film endured anyway, carrying more cultural weight because of the suppression than it would ever have accumulated through a straightforward release. Burying a film, it turns out, is one of the most reliable ways to ensure it gets remembered. Hollywood keeps discovering this fact and then forgetting it again almost immediately. Films caught between genuine artistic ambition and institutional discomfort tend to outlast the institutions that tried to contain them. The studios that did the burying rarely receive the same treatment from history. Films like these, stories of work that survived the people and systems trying to erase it, are exactly what this channel keeps digging into.